Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome to our live webinar, Transmission Investments and the Pathway to a Clean Energy Transition. My name is Michael Silber and I'm the event director for Enlit Australia, which is the conference and exhibition for the energy transition and is focused on the entire supply chain from end to end. And we are pleased to present this live virtual event. Certainly would like to thank and acknowledge our sponsor for today's event, Nexa Advisory. And before I hand this off to Stephanie Beshear, the moderator of today's session, there's a few housekeeping items to cover. First, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session. It will be on the Enlit World/Australia website. We've also added some attachments which are available through the handouts tab on the right-hand side of your screen. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentations. If you have any question for any of our speakers, please feel free to send it through the Ask Staff a question box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be answering questions during throughout the session today, but if we don't get to your question during today's webinar, we'll be sure to follow up afterwards. And last, we'd like to encourage you to share today's webinar with your social networks. It's now my pleasure to introduce Stephanie Beshear, Principal at Nexa Advisory, who will be your moderator today. And you can learn more about all of our panelists by clicking on the bio section, also on the right-hand side of your screen. Stephanie?
Thank you, Michael. Firstly, I'd like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, of elders past and present, on which we virtually meet today. I welcome everyone and thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon. I'm very excited to be hosting and moderating the session this afternoon. We want this session to be as interactive as possible, so please, as Michael suggested, send through your questions and the panel member you want the question to be addressed to, and hopefully we will get to all the questions as we go through the webinar. We are joined this afternoon by very senior industry leaders in the heart of the transition, including Chloe Hicks, representing the New South Wales government. And we're excited that she'll be giving us an inside scoop on the New South Wales electricity infrastructure roadmap policy announcement this afternoon. We are also very lucky to have David Swift, Independent Deputy Chair of the Energy Security Board, Lillian Patterson, Director Energy Transformation at the Clean Energy Council, and of course, Dr. Joel Gilmore, Manager Regulatory Affairs at Infogen. So I guess I will start this webinar by throwing a question to Chloe. Wonderful leadership by the New South Wales government and Minister Keane yesterday announcing the ambitious plan to become global renewable superpower. We know that 4 out of 5 existing coal power stations in New South Wales are due to expire over the next 15 years. Can you give us an overview of the key pillars of this landmark policy to enable that transition?
Thank you, Stephanie. It's fantastic to be here. I'd also like to just briefly acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land. I'm coming to you today from the land of the Eora people, Gadigal land, and I also pay my respects in particular to the Wiradjuri people and their land, which is where the first renewable energy zone will be hosted in the central west of New South Wales. As Stephanie said, yesterday we launched the Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap, which is an incredibly exciting new plan to drive coordinated investment in large-scale electricity infrastructure, and in particular transmission, generation and firming to help secure an affordable, reliable and clean energy future for New South Wales. There's 2 key pillars to this plan. The first is around a transmission development scheme. And this is, as many of us know, there have been challenges to date with developing large-scale transmission infrastructure, and particularly in a way to unlock generation at scale. And this has been at the core of the New South Wales government's work on renewable energy zones over the past 2 years. So under our transmission development scheme, we are targeting a significant reduction in the risk of network congestion and marginal loss factors, and really looking to unlock the large-scale transmission through a New South Wales-based transmission efficiency test, which will apply instead of the National Regulatory Investment Test for transmission. The second component is our electricity infrastructure investment safeguard. And this is a new mechanism aimed at giving industry and investors long-term revenue certainty so that they can build 3 different types of technologies that are needed to secure our energy future. And these are renewable energy, and in particular, renewable energy and renewable energy zones. The second technology is long duration storage, being storage of over 8 hours, such as probably initially pumped hydro, but in the future potentially batteries, and then also firming, which is dispatchable energy technologies. So the way that the safeguard works is that there will be long-term energy service agreements that will be entered into by a consumer trustee who will run competitive processes to get the best prices for energy consumers. Another component of the scheme is that we are introducing a new program called Pumped Hydro Recoverable Grants, which will be 50 million of recoverable grants. And the aim of that side of the roadmap is to really ensure that pumped hydro projects, which have lead times of, say, around 8 years, can actually be ready to compete in those competitive processes and kind of moved through those more risky feasibility stages, so that ultimately when they bid into the competitive processes, their costs are lower because they are somewhat de-risked in terms of that stage. So that's very much in a nutshell what the roadmap is, but there's a lot of detail that sits behind that, and I'm happy to talk through some of that today. I just note at a high level as well that this scheme is, or this roadmap, sorry, is expected to unlock around $32 billion of private investment by 2030, support around 9,000 jobs, mostly in regional New South Wales, deliver an expected 12 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030, and 2 gigawatts of long duration storage.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chloe. That sounds amazing. And with that, I will direct another question to Joel. Obviously, modernizing the grid will give clean energy investors confidence to build the next wave of projects. Joel, how is Infogen responding to the New South Wales government announcement?
Yeah, well, I think the first impression is very positive. I mean, this is a huge announcement in terms of meeting Australia's climate change commitments of 1.5 degrees. And I think there's a lot to like in the design. I mean, obviously, the res zones is something we've been saying for a while is critical for unlocking new renewables. It's probably the simplest way you can actually drive more renewables into the system is to build transmission out like we used to do for coal power stations and facilitate that access to it. We really like the idea that the contracts will be through swaptions rather than straight swaps like Victoria ACT has been doing. That really is consistent with the business model that we've been running to date, which is that we build renewables, and rather than signing long-term PPAs, we're bundling them up with our firming assets and on-selling those contracts to consumers. So that swaption approach is really consistent with that business model. We can still potentially sign these long-term deals with the New South Wales government for new projects, but then still sell that energy to consumers. And I think that's great for everyone. And I think highlighting this idea that the trustee will need to consider not just the cost, but the system need is really important. And that'll help flow into the design of those reses, the makeup of what actually gets built behind them and how they're utilised. I mean, if there's one downside, it's that the existing projects aren't going to have their value recognised. If you've built a wind or solar project to date, you're not going to have that asset recognised for its carbon reduction benefit. But that just means that in the long term, we still need some national approach to carbon, a carbon price or something similar that can recognize all that value. But I think it looks like a great start, and we'll certainly be gearing up to participate.
Thanks, Joel. And David, how does this fit in with the ESB's recent 2025 market design? We've just had a major consultation. It's a major project in shifting the transition forward. And how does that fit into your program of works? David,
I think you're on mute.
I think you're on mute.
We need one of those mute buckets, like the swear bucket they have at the Rotary Club or something, don't we? I seem to do that at least once every second day.
Oh, don't worry.
I think if you sort of take it back to the start of the ESB, it was actually around the Finkel review and implementing that, and really a recognition that the whole world has to change to cope with the future. And this is a kind of a step, a real step out by New South Wales, but it's in line with what we expect there, that the world will become far more driven by variable, renewable, by storage. And of course, what we have noticed with all of that is that the network is in the wrong place for that. And I might say that even extends to the distribution network. The distribution network's not going to be fit for purpose, but particularly the transmission network has got all the capacity in all the wrong places for the future. So one of the key things the ESB has been working on and got good support from ministers is in the actionable ISP, so getting the integrated system plan into the rules, getting arrangements in place that enable that to get developed, and for that whole transformation to really support that change. And we're certainly pleased that the New South Wales strategy leverages off that, and that's very important, because there's no sort of benefit to achieving a very nice res if that is not actually located within a national network that enables you to actually utilize those resources and shift them around to customers. So that's I think that they do tie together very much in some of those ways. I think there's also the issue, though, that the optimal development path, the development of the network that we're looking at, is the efficient development of the network to meet customer needs. So it certainly won't be uncongested or any part of it uncontested. So you've got to actually make sure that the backbone's being built, and we need arrangements in place to make sure that we efficiently connect to the grid, because that's going to cost customers money. So you want to make sure you maximise the utilisation of that grid, both in the connection sense and also in the operation of the grid. So that's a lot of where we're moving now. How do we actually populate reses, and how do we actually operate the system with this much more dynamic future power system? And that's an area we've been working very much with New South Wales, and appreciate their involvement in that sort of a process. I think the other part of the dimension for connection, first of all, you say, well, the current access regime doesn't work. I think we've all sort of come to that view, and even the consultation paper we've had has had support for that. And it's interesting to note that the New South Wales Act actually has provisions to override or create a different access regime, because it's going to be very important that when we build a res, that it is actually efficiently populated with a right mix of generation and storage and so on to efficiently use it. But it's also important that it's not overused, because obviously if you overpopulate the grid like we can at the moment with the rather haphazard development that's allowed now, you can get into real problems with congestion and low loss factors and technical problems. Then on that technical problems issue, I note that the AEMC has recently released its way forward on system strength, and that would support the development of RESs and the proactive dealing with system strength. And the ESB's work on essential system services overall should mean that overall you create a much better environment for connections and a much more known system to deal with. And I think that's important and be welcomed by a lot of investors as well. So then we need to really think about what are the long-term directions for the management of access to and operation of the grid. What's the transition path that's going to get us there? And how in the meantime do we implement renewable energy zones? And we'll certainly be keen to work with New South Wales and other interested jurisdictions as they sort of develop the regulations and the details around that as to how it would all work.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think this is a great segue to you, Lillian, as the peak body of the Clean Energy Council, but also as one of the leading experts on this topic. You know, how does this plan address some of these challenges faced by the industry and the members, and any further thoughts from, you know, from the broader panel?
Thanks, Stephanie. I think New South Wales announcement is, I echo Joel here. It's a great announcement. It's not just a big announcement, but it's a really clever one as well in terms of integrating a number of different factors around generation and transmission and firming into the one piece. So it's really comprehensive in that sense. I guess there are some elements that, you know, from the Clean Energy Council's perspective, we see that there are challenges that could be addressed and therefore opportunities through RESs. And I know, having spoken with Chloe and the department in the Minister's office, that considered in the New South Wales context. So some of the things that you know, we see as challenges at the moment that we see as being an opportunity to be addressed through process. So at the moment, the connection process for large-scale generators is just, it's problematic. It's been recognised as the biggest issue for our members at present. And that's for a number of different kind of technical reasons and resource reasons. But what it's leading to is delays in connecting new projects. So we're seeing delays as much as 12+ months for new projects. So that's from having to do connection studies and having to put synchronous condensers on. So millions of dollars being spent, which we see an opportunity in RESs is that potentially an improved connection process, a streamlined connection process for generators connecting in RESs. Also streamlined planning and environmental assessment. So this is something that is problematic for new developments and is an issue particularly in New South Wales. And I know this is something that is in the paper that was released yesterday, is to talk about a streamlined process around this for the New South RESs. Skills and workforce development is another big element that is creating challenges in this sector. We just don't have the skilled workforce, and we do need to develop that. And so that was part of the announcement that was made today around the manufacturing task force, was a recognition that there would also be a jobs task force. And so I think New South Wales is really looking at all the different elements to do with RESs and is really kind of trying to address all of those. And I don't think we can forget that community engagement is such a significant part of RES development. And you know, I think there's a real scope for developers, for the networks and the government to work together to ensure that the community is on board and all the issues they may have or the concerns are addressed, and that, you know, they can actually reap the benefits of all of this.
Thank you, Lillian. I guess just to pick up on some of the points some of you made, obviously this is a significant announcement. We are undergoing significant change overall in the electricity market, and that brings both, as you all mentioned, both disruption and an opportunity with some of these changes that are underway. Central to navigating successfully the transition to a net zero emissions future is obviously the transmission network. What do you see are the key barriers around around this transition and the transmission investments. You know, when we start talking about transmission networks, we all talk about renewable energy zones. You know, what do you see as the key role of renewable energy zones? And is there a role for the RIT going forward? Obviously, in New South Wales, they've made that decision to move away from the RIT. So I'm really interested in the panel's view on that. Maybe we can start. Who wants to go first? Joel.
Sure. Yeah. Look, I mean, the RIT is obviously like it's beautiful economics. The problem is that at the moment, perhaps it doesn't fully account for the risks. You know, we keep talking a lot about these asymmetric risks with these unlocking technologies like system strength and even transmission. If you don't have enough, things become very costly. You can't build the resources you need. If you overbuild, well, there is some inefficiency there in the short term, but it's probably going to get used up later. And I think, you know, when you look at areas like Western Victoria at the moment, clearly that is a great location to build renewables. And the fact that it's been delays and connection issues there, I think shows that there are some problems at the moment. Also, you look at Energy Connect, where the scenarios are modeled for that, 75% of the weighting is for scenarios that don't even come close to meeting a climate change scenario. They're 3 to 4 degree warming scenarios. So when you look at the high climate change scenarios or the realistic scenarios, of course, that's a valuable asset to build. So we do need frameworks that really captures that. And just don't get hung up on the rounding errors around the cost of some of these resources. I guess the only thing I'd say, though, is that we need to make sure there is a two-way discussion here. It's not enough just to take the AEMO's ISP, for example, and see where it goes to build renewables. Well, it's a model, and if an area is $1 a megawatt hour cheaper than another, of course, it will build all of its resources in that area. In practice, there are great sites in lots of different areas, and we need to make sure that those developers, those site selection is feeding up to the selection of reses. And I think that you know, New South Wales government has clearly taken that on board with the way that they've developed these reses and the huge number of projects you got as expression of interest for the 3 gigawatt res. It was 27 gigawatts of projects, something like that. I mean, I showed
that. Yeah, that was it. 27 gigawatts for 3 gigawatts of capacity, so 9 times what we need.
So I think that's great. That's showing that, you know, this is a useful res and one that really does need to be developed. I guess it's also just, we don't want to leave out the other areas as well, that we need to make sure that projects all around the states, or Australia indeed, that are useful can be developed.
Just building on what Joel and Lillian and David have all said, I'd agree with the challenges to building transmission that have already been noted. I think there's really 3 that are quite clearly set out in our electricity infrastructure roadmap. The first really is that chicken and egg problem around the fact that you need transmission that's committed before you can get generators to be able to commit to their projects and get the finance they need to build. But then at the same time, in order to build the transmission, you need to know that the generation will be there. And that's why we have taken this coordinated approach to help everything to develop in parallel. The second is, I think, the open access regime, as David mentioned, has been a real challenge, and the free rider problems are really well articulated, including through the AEMC's COGADI review. That really have prevented renewable energy zones from sort of naturally coming forward through the current market. And that's why we are really looking at a special access regime that will acknowledge those generators that invest in transmission and help ensure that that new infrastructure can be built. And that also allows them to have a better understanding of their marginal loss factor risk, congestion risk, so that they can factor that into the investment and hopefully reduce the upfront cost of capital. The third point that I'm particularly passionate about, and Lillian really spoke well to this, is about the social license for transmission. We haven't built this scale of infrastructure in 50 to 70 years in New South Wales when we first developed our transmission grids. And also, as David said, we're doing this in areas that haven't currently seen transmission projects before. So ensuring that the communities come along on this journey and that we genuinely have social license will be critical to ensuring that these projects can go forward. So I think really grounding the integrated system plan in that sort of, localized, on the ground, do communities want it? Where do they want it? Ensuring that they genuinely benefit for hosting this infrastructure will be really important to helping with this transition that we know that we all need to do. One final point, was Joel also spoke about ensuring that it's not just those first 3 renewable energy zones, and I completely agree. We've started with the pilot 3,000 megawatt Central West Renewable Energy Zone, which will be followed by the New England Renewable Energy Zone and the Southwest Renewable Energy Zone, which really ties in with Energy Connect. So that's the reason it's not yet the one that we're moving quickly with, because we're making sure it fits in with other ISP projects. But the electricity infrastructure roadmap will also create a framework that will allow additional renewable energy zones to be proposed, to come forward for us to do more analysis, and also for the private sector to lead renewable energy zones. So yes, these are the first priority ones, but we expect more, considering that we do need to replace 4 of our remaining 5 coal-fired power stations in the next 15 years. So there's a significant amount of infrastructure investment to come.
I just wanted to touch on one thing. Oh, no, sorry, Lynn, you go.
Mine will be quick. I just want to go back to your original question around the RIT process, and we've spoken a lot here about the community and the community, the benefits to community and engaging the community. We can't also forget that we need to engage with customers as well, and that's such a that's an integral part of the RIT that we have at the moment, is ensuring that there is a net benefit to customers for new transmission build. And while I think that there are some issues with the RIT, and that's demonstrated in the fact that New South Wales is progressing a different test, and also we have to remember that Victoria has also progressed legislation in order to derogate away and be able to undertake transmission build that doesn't require a RIT. But in doing that, I think it's really important that we stress, and I know this is an important part of the New South Wales piece, is that there still needs to be that consumer benefit at the end of the day, that we should be building transmission for consumers, and that we should continue to have rigor around the transmission development test to ensure that consumers are protected at the end of the day.
Yeah, look, I think that's a great point, Lillian, and it's one of the things we in energy, we get so excited, and we're always, in our energy bubble in the industry. But fundamentally, energy is an essential service, and all the work we do needs to be orderly and affordable to all Australians. So I think, a lot of the policies that are coming through with that in mind, and we've started actually getting some questions from the audience. So if you don't mind holding that thought, Joel, for a few minutes while we take some questions. So the first question we've got is great visionary roadmap, Chloe, but how can batteries participate? Doesn't appear technology neutral from a storage perspective. Has the New South Wales government considered defining what services or firming is needed, and then letting market outcomes drive the type of technology, whether pumped, hydro, or batteries?
Thank you for the question. We absolutely see batteries as being a key part of delivering this roadmap. There's a couple of different areas where we see that batteries would, well, actually, I think across all 3 components of the electricity infrastructure investment safeguard, we would see investments in batteries. The first would be alongside renewable energy generation projects to help with with the way that they are able to competitively bid into the process with their set profile, for example. The second would be in the long duration storage round, and yes, it is 8 hours, but we do see that the technology improvements in batteries means that we would expect that batteries will be part of that round in the future. And the third is around the firming element, which would absolutely be open to batteries. And the firming rounds, while we don't have a set development pathway for that round, those firming rounds will be triggered if there's if it's seen that there's a potential breach in our energy security target, which was set out in our electricity strategy at the end of last year. So I think that batteries could play a role in all three components of the infrastructure safeguard, and even potentially as well in terms of innovations around the transmission side, non-network solutions, also looking at different system strength opportunities, particularly looking at how we can support aggregated system strength solutions within a renewable energy zone, which I know is something I've spoken a lot with David and others about.
Yeah, I think it's going to be important as we try to get this efficient use of the system I was talking about. As Chloe says, if you get the right mix of generation of different types, so if you had solar and wind and some batteries in a res, then you should be able to efficiently connect more generation to that res than you would otherwise. So I think as you go forward, there'll be an incentive on the res developer there, the authority doing that, to try to get the best mix, and I'm sure that would include some battery storage to try to maximize the use of the transmission infrastructure that's being built. You know, I think that's going to be imperative going forward, because I mean, one of the disappointing things about transmission is it hasn't had the exciting cost reductions that we've seen in solar and wind and batteries, and it's very expensive. So you've got to actually make sure that you put a lot of effort into deploying it well and using it efficiently.
Another question here that we've got from the audience is, what renewable penetration do you consider is feasible for a stable and secure transmission network? So I guess it goes back to some of the points you were making earlier, Chloe and David.
Yeah, I can't give you a specific statistic on that. However, I can talk to the fact that we know that we can have high, and that's in particular as we're adding more asynchronous generation into the mix. So I can't
Chloe.
Statistic, but absolutely, I think we're looking to increase the use of renewable energy, also ensure that the transmission is being used as efficiently as possible, which also
yeah, I think we had Chloe's having some internet issues. I'm really sorry, everyone. We might just move on to the next.
I wouldn't mind taking a crack at that question, Stephanie, just to subvert it. I actually think it's the wrong question to ask. I think the right question to ask is, we know that the end state will be a 100% renewable system. So the question is, what needs to be done to get there as quickly as possible? So that means that AEMO needs to I say this with all the love, but stop running studies looking at what maximum penetrations there are and start looking at how do we get to 100%. What level of synchronous condensers or fast frequency response from batteries, grid forming batteries do we need? How do we unlock all those resources? And that goes to the point of these reses where you can coordinate these resources at once. And it goes to transmission more generally, that we need enough transmission to be able to share renewables around Australia. So I think we just need to move away from that mindset of there is some limit, because as far as I can see, there are no technical limits. We just have to work at how you actually operate it safely. But hopefully that doesn't contradict what you were going to say, Chloe, before you cut out.
Yes, well, I was just going to say that obviously that's a big part of the post-2025 market design, and that's an important supporting feature to all these projects, is that we need a market design and arrangements which will actually ensure that we remain sort of secure and reliable system for customers that actually incorporates these much higher levels of variable renewable energy and distributed energy. And as people would have seen, we've been doing a lot of work on that and thinking about the different services. As Joel said, you've got to think about how do we retain some of the services that we used to get for free from conventional generators. What's the technology? How do we implement those in our markets? And so that's a key part of what we're doing. And I'm sure that those boundaries are going to move out over time as technology evolves to meet these needs. And we already have in the NEM, we already have two batteries which have sort of world-leading grid forming capabilities. In large Tesla has what's called a virtual machine mode to try to emulate some of the characteristics of synchronous machines. So expect that sort of thing to continue. So whatever we can achieve now, we'll be building on with the market design, and I expect we'll bring forward some newer technologies over the next decade to enable us to meet the much higher levels of renewable generation we can expect into the future.
And I guess as a follow-up question, in terms of focusing on batteries and technologies, demand flexibility, one of the questions here is demand flexibility is a resource that can cheaply integrate renewables. Obviously, it's discussed as part of the 2025 market design. There's been a lot of major reforms recently around it. How does this demand flexibility best fit into the New South Wales strategy and the transition to clean energy future? But really, it's not just the New South Wales strategy. It's much broader in terms of the clean energy transition. And I'll start with Chloe and then perhaps move to Lillian.
I'm just going to test that you can now all hear me. You're smiling, so I think that's a good sign. So in terms of how it fits in with the New South Wales government policy, it's a really good point, and it was a key part of our electricity strategy that we released at the end of last year. Was an energy security safeguard. So that came before this latest policy, and that's about providing incentives for demand reduction at times of peak demand. It was also designed to increase our energy efficiency or energy saving scheme as well. So I think that's really important, but I'm also really interested in exploring how we can look at the renewable energy zones as being a key part of managing demand as well, and in particular the role of batteries, absolutely, but other smart technologies. So moving beyond just the generation side and looking at the demand side with renewable energy zones as well.
Yeah, and if I can just follow on from that, I think one of the interesting aspects that needs to be explored in terms of renewable energy zones and the demand side is, I think, the panacea of the system is co-locating generation and load. And so to the extent that we can think about how we can actually get load to locate in renewable energy zones is something we should also be thinking about. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen development and an export industry using renewable energy to produce green steel and things like that. And we should be really thinking about how we can get that side of the equation to co-locate in with generation in the renewable energy zones.
Joel,
Yes. Oh, sorry. I'll make one quick point, which is that we did announce also a renewables manufacturing task force this morning, which is looking at how you can also ensure that we're thinking about the whole supply chain and how do we have a more sustainable and local supply chain. Now that we've got this long-term energy infrastructure pipeline, that should provide the certainty needed for manufacturers to also transition their operations. And a key part of that could also be having the cheap fuel inputs from the renewable energy. So ending up with a bit of a circular economy there around the way that renewable energy zones are both manufactured and what they power at the same time.
David or Joel, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think it's clearly an important point that you've got a lot more variable supply side opportunities coming up. You really want to make sure you're taking the maximum advantage of flexibility on the demand side as well to meet that, and to make sure that is part of the whole mix. And so that is a key part of the ESB's work on the future market design. And an amount of that requires enablement, both at the large scale level and a lot of potentially investment in things like smelters to improve their flexibility of use, as well as systems implementation for a lot of demand side at the aggregated consumer level, and taking advantage of some of the new digitalization techniques possible. And there's certainly plenty of trials in place at the moment looking at virtual power plants and how we can actually get some more flexibility in that area and actually provide value to consumers in the process. So that's a major area of development for the ESB is what can we do to provide opportunities for the demand side to participate in that as well. And you know, I know traders and people operating in the market will also much more use demand side where it's a good part of a portfolio to meet customers' needs.
And that's certainly what Infogen does, that we've got a portfolio of physical assets, long duration like gas, we have batteries, we have demand response. And I think, you know, from a system need, we do want to think about, rather than trying to build extreme peakers for these more than 1 in 10 year events, demand response is the perfect solution to that reliability. And I think that's come through in a lot of the ESB discussion, which is really good. And it benefits consumers because they then get paid for that flexibility that they can deliver.
We might jump back to the roadmap. And there's a question that's come through on how does the firming leg of the roadmap incentivize the generators, fuel-based, that need to exist for the multiple days long wind solar drought? It appears all firming and storage incentives solely focused on the intraday solutions will crowd out all technology investments that will be needed for these longer periods. I'm not sure if that's more of a statement someone's making or a question, but do you have anything that you might want to respond to that, Chloe? I mean, obviously, you know, you're still going to go on through the consultation for the detail and everything else, but keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so on the sort of, you know, longer term, longer duration storage, that's a real reason why we have set up the long duration storage component of the scheme. And we do see that pumped hydro can provide that you know, multi-day, multi-week storage as needed, as well as other system strength services back to the network. So there will be 2 gigawatts indicatively of long duration storage supported by 2030. And that is in line with what the integrated system plan shows as needed for New South Wales. On the firming side, it could also support things like gas and other dispatchable technologies, seeing that it will be technology neutral. So I don't see any reason why they can't be part of that component of the safeguard.
So Chloe, would you expect that the trustee would be trying to make that decision between whether they want a 8-hour peaker or a, unlimited potentially gas generator? Is that the sort of questions they'd be deciding?
Yeah, so the role of the consumer trustee will be to run competitive rounds for the 3 different technology types, and to make just have my lights go out and to have make sure that those investments are made in the best interests of energy consumers. And they'll be looking at the whole of the system costs, and that includes how things work with transmission, also how things look for consumers, not just immediately, but also over time, because they will be entering into long-term contracts, as well as potentially hedging contracts that will sit behind those as well in the interests of consumers. But yes, it will ultimately be up to the consumer trustee to pick the right portfolio of projects to deliver on its mandate, which is to deliver a secure, clean, and most importantly, an affordable energy mix for New South Wales consumers.
Thanks for that. We talked a lot about the community and social licensing. So this is a question to Lillian. Transmission lines are not exactly pretty, someone rightly said, and are typically uneconomic to place underground over the service life. How will policymakers and renewable generators help to sell the need for the lines to the communities impacted by line construction? And are there many renewable supporters, but not in their own backyard?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. I think this is a really important question that that we do need to think about in the industry. The renewable sector has spent a number of years now looking into growing our social license and engaging with communities and addressing their concerns and thinking about the benefit sharing from renewable projects, not just for those projects, for those landholders that hold a particular project on their land, but also the broader community around them. So, the neighbours and the people down the road, and how do we share the benefits of renewables around a community? This isn't something that has traditionally been looked at, I understand, for the transmission or for the network sector. And it's an important question that we should be looking at. My understanding is that for transmission, you get a one-off payment for holding a transmission tower on your property, whereas a renewable sector has an ongoing payment over the life of the asset. And so with the renewable sector and the transmission or the network sector, they need to work together on how we can address these issues and these community concerns. And the transmission sector or the network sector has a lot to learn from the renewable sector, and something that we are actively engaging with them on to talk about what our sector has been doing in terms of the benefit sharing and how that can be extended into the transmission sector as well.
This is an area I'm also quite passionate about, so I might just build on what Lillian said. And we're really interested in and are working really collaboratively with Transgrid, for example, on the Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone in opportunities for transmission lines to incorporate things like community investment models or benefit sharing schemes, as well as looking at things like local procurement, Aboriginal jobs and training programs, and ways that you can actually deliver really good on the ground community benefits through the transmission lines, not just the generation. The other thing that's really important, I think, is consulting with the community early. And yes, it's a linear infrastructure project, and there may always need to be some level of acquisitions involved in these type of linear infrastructure projects. But while you have flexibility, making sure that you are working really closely with the community, and that the first they hear of a project isn't just a transmission company saying, look, we'd like to assess your property for a transmission line, but really making sure they understand the messaging and why this is important and how they'll be involved. And that's why we're setting up in New South Wales a new entity to coordinate the renewable energy zones, which is called the Energy Corporation of New South Wales, and coordinating consultation and benefit sharing on both the transmission and generation sides will be one of the key roles of that new entity.
Thank you. I've got a few more questions, but I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get through all of them this afternoon. Obviously, it's a topic we could talk about this for hours, especially after the announcement yesterday. There's so much to discuss. One of the questions, I guess this is, to Chloe, but also more broadly, if we kind of take a more national approach to David around, the plans. What plans do you have for an extreme scenario where grid failure might take place?
Well, I guess one of the issues we have been looking at is called is around the resilience of a modern day grid. There's a lot of work being done looking at, what are the future exposures and what's happening with weather. There's a multi-million-dollar project funded by the government and AEMO is a part of, trying to really get a handle and an understanding on where those future climate risks would be to the system. Obviously, we saw last summer some really severe impacts of those bushfires. So there's work going on in a range of those areas. So there's a whole program of work thinking about what do we do about the resilience of the grid and therefore thinking about its ability to withstand these sorts of events. But you have to be careful in thinking about that. It's not just then saying, well, you should build a grid that's twice as big or whatever. Obviously, that's going to cost consumers a lot. But it's about understanding exactly what the risks and nature of those risks are. Some of them it'll be sensible to design out, but many of them it'll be more sensible to come up with operating arrangements or arrangements that happen when the contingency occurs to minimise the effect on customers. I'd also say that some of the work going on is showing some of the benefits of the new world in this environment. There's work going on looking at the ability to have something closer to standalone grids that are interconnected together in some of these areas where they are very susceptible to bushfires, so communities can have a level of local generation, potentially local storage. There's been work done on the coordination between networks and electricity networks and telecommunications. Again, looking to how you support local customer groups in those sorts of environments. So, yeah, sure, resilience is an important matter in the future, but it's also taken into account in part in the ISP. So you'll see that there are diverse paths designed into that. So you'll see a new link into Victoria goes through the centre of Victoria rather than continuing to concentrate on the snowy region. You'll see that you've got a completely different path through Energy Connect to South Australia, a second QNI that's quite distant from the current QNI. So there are built into the design a number of resilience impacts, but I'm sure this is going to be an important issue that's going to be further developed over the coming years.
Absolutely. I guess, we've only got another 6 or 7 minutes to go with the webinar. I would like to give each of the opportunity for closing remarks. But before you do your closing remarks, obviously transmission investment discussion is, and access has been going on for a number of years now. and especially with the Kogati reforms that have been underway. So it'll be good to hear from each of the panel members with your closing remarks, your views on the Kogati reforms, especially after the recent consultation and the significant pushback from stakeholders on some of these reforms. We can go around. We can start with you, Joel, or we can, you know, feel free to nominate who goes first.
But I'm happy to stick my neck out first. We've been saying for a couple of years now that Kogati is the worst solution looking for a problem. It doesn't address any of the actual issues in the NEM, and if you wanted to kill renewable investment, it'd be a great thing to pursue. So in contrast, you know, the RES approach that New South Wales is taking and other regions have been exploring, that actually gets to the heart of the problem we're facing, which is that we need to unlock new renewables and we need to get the transmission there and all those other resources like system strength at the same time. We have to get that done. We talk about like things that can go wrong in the grid. That happens in lots of time scales from the millisecond, but also to the years. And I think the worst case scenario is what we've seen over the last few years, where we had policy uncertainty and then suddenly we had a few years to build the RET and everything went pear-shaped. We had a gold rush conditions, generators rushing and trying to build in a very short window. And that's where the problems came from. I actually disagree, David. I think that idea that we had a sort of an uncoordinated or haphazard approach to the network. I think everyone was making rational decisions. They just didn't have all the information at the time. So we do need a way that we can act sooner rather than later and have a smooth transition rather than get to 2030 and then suddenly we recognize that climate change is a problem. Ideally, that would be a national approach where we're all on the same page and we have a similar planning framework to work towards, but I think we're away from that. And schemes like this from New South Wales is a perfect stepping stone that we can build up these capabilities. So I'm much more excited about the future today than I was on the weekend. So this is great.
Thank you. David or Chloe?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's certainly clear that there's a lot of opposition to the Kogati proposal, and we've certainly got that loud and clear from the consultation. What I would say is that you do need something on two aspects, and the New South Wales legislation recognises you need something to make actually the efficient location even within a RES work. So you've got to have some new access regime of some type, and so we're exploring options there as to how that could work and also how that might be transitioned to whatever that is. I'd also say that the operation of the future grid is going to be quite difficult without some shift, because all these new RESs, or almost all of them, are on inter-regional paths and close to boundaries. So if we had the current arrangements in the market, we'd finish up with negative flows across boundaries. We'd have clamping of interconnectors and all sorts of inefficiencies like that. So we need something to help manage the population, even of the RESs, and the operation of the power system in a much different future where you've got a lot more nameplate capacity sitting on the grid. You know, customers have been pushing back on the expansion to the grid that is in the ISP that the ESB strongly supports, but it's not very big compared to the amount of extra generation going in. You get a relatively modest increase in the capacity of the network, and yet we got up to 90,000 megawatts of capacity sitting on that in about 15 years' time. So we certainly are working on what the options are to deal with those sort of two key issues. And RESs are not by themselves a solution. In fact, RESs need a solution to access to make them work.
Thanks. Look, I think we're running out of time, but before I hand it over to Michael, I just want to thank you all very, very much for participating. And But just before we close, I think, Lillian, I'd like to hear your closing remarks and views on the Coogati, seeing as though you represent quite a big major number of industry and investors.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. You know, Joel really hit it on the head with this is a reform that the renewable energy industry doesn't want nor feels that it needs at this time. There's a real strong sense that this is the wrong reform at the wrong time. And so there's we're seeing the actioning of the ISP. We're seeing other bits and pieces that are happening to improve locational signals and information in the market. And we should allow those things to play out before we move to something that is so drastic in introducing a new reform across all participants. This isn't just aimed at the new participants who can react to locational signals, but will actually have implications for all generators. It's really interesting to review the submissions on Coogati and see that there's fairly lukewarm support across not just the renewable sector, but all type of participants and consumers as well. And that's quite telling. And so, you know, I know that David and the ESB and the AMC are hearing that, and they're seeing that, and we're hopeful that, you know, we'll get the right response out of this.
I might just touch briefly on Coogati as well. So we've been working really closely with the AMC as well as with David's team at the ESB around ensuring that our New South Wales renewable energy zones can be incorporated into future post-2025 market reforms, for example. But what we're really prioritising is the fact that we need to do coordination of generation and transmission investment on the ground, and we need to start that soon, and we need to get the learnings, and we need to develop the models very quickly, because as I said before, we've got 15 years till we lose four of our existing power stations. It took Texas 9 years to implement the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones program. So we are moving ahead in New South Wales, but in a way that we hope can then align with the national processes in the future. We're piloting the Central West and aiming to have that shovel ready by the end of 2022. And I just also note that this will be a really exciting but also challenging project to move quickly and to do something that is the first of its kind in Australia. We've done significant analysis and modelling to get to where we are, but it will be a really collaborative process going forward. And we look forward to really consulting with industry and communities, market bodies and others going forward to really make sure we get the details right for the roadmap and the renewable energy zones.
Okay. On behalf of Inlit Australia, I'd like to thank all of you for your time and for your insights, and remind our audience there is a recording of today's webcast, as well as other digital interviews and presentations that Inlit Australia has done, and you can find them on our website. It's inlit-australia.com. Really a special thank you to Stephanie Beshear and Nexa Advisory for their sponsorship of this event. Personal thank you to Stephanie for helping us and working with us on our live event last year as a moderator. And certainly we're hoping she joins us and all of you join us March 10th and 11th in Melbourne for our live event, which promises to be lively and vibrant next as we enter the new year. If you'd like any additional information about Inlit Australia, please feel free to contact myself or any member of the team whose details are currently on your screen. And I thank everybody for joining us. And again, thank you to our panelists and to Stephanie Beshear and Nexa Advisory. Good evening, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Yeah.
Great to chat.